Vicente, let's go!
Mais barato ainda, R$ 50, pagamento em dinheiro direto na bilheteria. É isso mesmo. Promoção de 30
Soquinho!
Água Show Park. Acesse aguashowpark.com.br.
Hello, welcome to episode 5 of Pathos Metamorphose. This episode is dedicated to Mitch Driver, who lost his battle with the mental health issues that he was experiencing. Something he was apparently struggling with on his own. It was largely unknown to friends and family. I want to mention that if anyone needs help during dark times when life seems unbearable, you're not alone. You're not the only one going through it, and there are also people who would like to help as God's hands and feet. One resource is the suicide hotline at 1-800-273-8255. They are available 24/7. I also want to dedicate this show to anyone struggling with any mental health issue, whether it be depression, anxiety, or anything else. Again, know that you're not alone. Please get help when you need it. We all need help sometimes, and there's no shame in needing help. Okay, on this episode of Pathos Metamorphose, I'd like to focus in on the fact that we being members of the beloved community, the human race, are created in the image of God. That's what I believe. By the way, I wanted to also mention that if I come across as a bit pedantic ever, please forgive me. Or, for example, I was talking about the rapture and kind of what I've come to believe over time on that issue. And certainly there are many in the Christ-following community who believe strongly in the rapture, and I count them as brothers and sisters in Christ. It's just something for thought, and wanted to talk about my kind of evolution of thought towards that and eschatology in general, and how our beliefs can impact our worldview and how we live that out in terms of believing whether or not the world is going to come to an end and God's going to take us home and leave some people behind. That's kind of what the rapture theology talks about, and it's kind of based around primarily one verse, set of verses in the New Testament. Anyway, so again, I hope some of this information helps people or helps people to think a little bit more about these topics and to engage thoughtfully and respectfully on these topics. So I want to mention the Imago Dei. That's Latin for the God's image, and the thought that all human beings are created in the image of God. And on this basis, every human being has equal worth and is worthy of honor and respect. I think that's not something Christians would generally disagree with. But living that out sometimes looks different among followers of Christ. So starting from that perspective, I want to talk about race and racial distinctions and how these are social constructions. And also how this social construct of race is really part and parcel with racism, which so often accompanies it. From there, we'll talk about how every ethnic group, and ethnic group being a more broad and I would say biblical categorization of people groups than the social construct of race, about how every ethnic group are members of the beloved community, like I said earlier, which is the human race, and are worthy of honor and respect as God's image bearers. So, since I'm contending that race is a social construct, how did this idea of race develop? According to Britannica.com, you search up the history and idea of race, and I'm quoting here, the history of the idea of race as a categorizing term referring to human beings was first used in the English language in the late 16th century. Until the 18th century, it had a generalized meaning similar to other classifying terms such as type, sort, or kind, end quote. So, when did race move from meaning a way of general classification to become a term to classify groups of people by socially constructed and dare I say pseudo-scientific traits or characteristics? Well, this is from A History of the Concept of Race, Science for the People magazine, section called Early Scientific Theories of Race. And I quote, "After race as a scientific term was first introduced by the French philosopher-scientist Georges de Buffon in 1749, the term was expanded into a system for the classification of the varieties of humankind by Johann Friedrich Blumenbach in his book On the Natural Variety of Mankind, written in 1775. Both Buffon and Blumenbach recognized that all human beings belong to a single species and used race as a convenience to distinguish between certain geographically localized groups. Buffon's and Blumenbach's use of the term race reflected the time in which they lived, an era which the American and French revolutions were expounding the philosophies that all men are created equal and liberty, equality, fraternity, and a time when the African slave trade purported to save souls." And this is from a Wikipedia article, the Wikipedia article on Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. Born in 1752, died in 1840, he was a German physician, naturalist, physiologist, and anthropologist, considered to be a main founder of zoology and anthropology as comparative scientific disciplines. He was also important as a race theorist. He was one of the first to explore the study of the human being as an aspect of natural history. His teachings in comparative anatomy were applied to his classification of human races, of which he claimed there were 5: Caucasian, Mongolian, Malayan, Ethiopian, and American. He was a member of what modern historians call the Göttingen School of History. Not sure if I'm pronouncing Göttingen or Göttingen correctly. Blumenbach's peers considered him one of the great theorists of his day, and he was a mentor or influence on many of the next generation of German biologists, he's from Germany, including Alexander von Humboldt. I didn't do a lot of research on this, but I would imagine that he would influenced. Now let me look into that before I say much. But I would imagine that he had some influence on Nazi development and thought. At the advent of the Second Great Awakening, a Christian revival that occurred in the early 19th century, the anti-slavery abolitionist movement was born. I think this is between the period of 1825 to 1833, if I'm remembering correctly, but I'm going off the page here and I'm still quoting. With this justified call to abolish, actually I'm not quoting here, this is stuff I picked up here. The end quote there was Alexander von Humboldt, after I quoted him, after I mentioned that Blumenbach's peers consider him one of the great theorists of his days. He's a mentor or influence on many of the next generation of German biologists, including Alexander von Humboldt. So, at the advent of the Second Great Awakening, a Christian revival in the early 19th century, the anti-slavery abolitionist movement was born. And with this justified call to abolish the race-based chattel slavery of that period, the South needed to come up with a justification for it. The race-based chattel slavery. So let's unpack what I mean by race-based chattel slavery and how it was justified. So again, this is from A History of the Concept of Race, Science for the People magazine. The subtitle is The Scientific Theory of Racial Inequality. Faced with external, and I'm quoting here, faced with external and internal attacks and no longer able to defend slavery in the old way, the Southern ruling class came to rely on a new, stronger defense of the slave system. As John C. Calhoun proclaimed, and this is a quote within the larger quote here, "It's not enough for the Southern people to believe that slavery has been entailed upon us by our forefathers. We must satisfy the consciences. We must allay the fears of our own people. We must satisfy them that slavery is of itself a right, that it is not a sin against God, that it is not an evil, moral, or political, that is not an evil, moral, or political. In this way, and this way only, can we prepare our own people to defend their institutions." End of quote by John C. Calhoun within the larger quote here, and I'll continue with the larger quote. Thomas R. Dew and William Harper responded to Calhoun's call by uniting Buffon's and Blumenbach's system of classification with Aristotle's defense of slavery, which said, "He is then by nature formed a slave who is fitted to become the chattel of another person, and on that account is so." Thus, the scientific theory of the natural inequality of different groups of humans was born as a justification of slavery on the basis of racial inequality. The Southern race theorists asserted, yet never proved, the factual validity of the existence of distinct types of human beings called races. They argued from the empirical observations that people with black skins under the conditions of slavery did not have the educational, intellectual, and political attainment of their masters to the scientific conclusion that this inequality was biological and hence inevitable. They tried to convert a social and economic fact into a biological one. The purpose and effect of such a theory was to give the Southern slave owners a powerful ideological weapon. Slavery was no longer a moral question. It was the best possible system, given the biological reality of the inequality between the races. An inequality which was the result of God's work and which had been brought to light by science. End quote. See, slavery in some form had been in existence since probably time immemorial. Certainly read about it in Old Testament biblical times. However, with race-based chattel slavery, I want to talk about two conceptions which made it that much more insidious. One, the concept of race distinctions being the justification for enslaving another human being. And two, the concept of total ownership of another human being. This is what's meant by chattel. Chattel is an item of property other than real estate, such as livestock or animals would be classified as chattel. So basically, those enslaved were subhuman in this arrangement. And in fact, in law, under the 3/5 Compromise of 1787, and it was a compromise because many did not want to admit that slaves were even 3/5 of a human being. So under that compromise of 1787, the enslaved person was considered 3/5 of a person. This view was held until 1868, which was shortly after the Civil War. And of course, after that, in the Reconstruction South, up until civil rights legislation, which you have being enacted in 1964, 1965, and 1968, respective to employment, voting, and housing rights. Those three things respectively in those years, 64, 65, and 68. That's not very long ago, is it? I just want to mention some milestones in the civil rights movement. And I really want to, besides dedicating this show because of the timely reason for Mitch Driver, I really want to dedicate this to those who have who are still around and have suffered injustice due to racism, and many who maybe today are suffering injustice due to racism. So I'll just kind of go through some of the timeline here. 1948, we had President Harry Truman issuing an executive order 9981 to end segregation in the armed services. By the way, this is I got this online, and I'm going to link to it where I found it so that you have it. But I can't tell you right now because I don't have it right in front of me where I got it. But 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. A consolidation of 5 cases into one is decided by the Supreme Court, effectively ending racial segregation in public schools. Many schools, however, remained segregated. And this was, you still had the Jim Crow thing going on after the Civil War. And I can't really unpack the Jim Crow thing, but basically if you look that up, after slavery was, the slaves were emancipated, there was still a struggle with integrating blacks into society, and of course there were segregationists still who, up until not very long ago, wanted to impose their will as well. So in 1955, we had a couple of key things happening. These are, and there are probably many more than what I'm listing here. But in Emmett Till, on August 28th, the 14-year-old from Chicago is brutally murdered in Mississippi for allegedly flirting with a white woman. His murderers are acquitted, and the case brings international attention to the civil rights movement after Jet magazine publishes a photo of Till's beaten body at his open casket funeral. December 1st, 1955, very key moment. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man in a Montgomery, Alabama bus. Her defiant stance prompts a year-long Montgomery bus boycott. January 10th through 11th, 1957, roughly a year or so later, 60 black pastors and civil rights leaders from several southern states, including Martin Luther King Jr., they meet in Atlanta, Georgia, to coordinate nonviolent protests against racial discrimination and segregation. September 4th, 1957, you have 9 black students known as the Little Rock Nine that are blocked from integrating into Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. President Dwight D. Eisenhower eventually sends federal troops to escort the students. However, they continue to be harassed. Again, this is 1957. Not that long ago. I mean, yes, 65 plus years ago, but still not that long ago. So on September 9th, in 1957, Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. So that's another civil rights piece of legislation besides the earlier ones I mentioned, into law to help protect voter rights. The law allows federal prosecution of those who suppress another's right to vote. February 1st, 1960, 4 African-American college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, refused to leave a Woolworth's whites-only lunch counter without being served. The Greensboro Four, Ezell Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil, were inspired by the non-violent protests of Gandhi. The Greensboro sit-in, as it came to be called, sparked similar sit-ins throughout the city and in other states. November 14th, same year, 1960, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges is escorted by 4 armed federal marshals as she becomes the first student to integrate William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans. Her actions inspired Norman Rockwell's painting, The Problem We All Live With. Wow, very courageous. That's great. Norman Rockwell. I have to look that up. That was in 1964 that he did that painting. 1961, throughout 1961, black and white activists known as Freedom Riders took bus trips to the American South to protest segregated bus terminals in a attempted to use whites-only restrooms and lunch counters. The Freedom Rides were marked by horrific violence from white protesters, and they drew international attention to their cause. Now you have the civil rights movement here. One date here is June 11th, 1963. Governor George C. Wallace stands in a doorway at the University of Alabama to block 2 black students from registering. The standoff continues until President John F. Kennedy sends the National Guard to the campus. August 28th, same year, approximately 250,000 people take part in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech as the closing address in front of the Lincoln Memorial, stating, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." September 15th, a bomb at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, kills 4 young girls and injures several other people prior to Sunday services. The bombing fuels angry protests, as you might imagine. July 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law, preventing employment discrimination due to race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. Title VII of the Act establishes the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, to help prevent workplace discrimination. Many of us, go through courses that talk about EEOA, and that was a direct result of that piece of legislation. February 25th, February 21st, and I don't do any editing on these, so February 21st, 1965, black religious leader Malcolm X is assassinated during a rally by members of the Nation of Islam. March 7th, same year, Bloody Sunday, in the Selma to Montgomery March, around 600 civil rights marchers walked to Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, the state's capital, in protest of black voter suppression. Local police block and brutally attack them. After successfully fighting in court for their right to march, Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders lead 2 more marches and finally reach Montgomery on March 25th. August 8th, 1965, President Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to prevent the use of literacy tests as a voting requirement. It also allowed federal examiners to review voter qualifications and federal observers to monitor polling places. April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on the balcony of his hotel room in Memphis, Tennessee. James Earl Ray is convicted of the murder in 1969. April 11th, same year, President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act, providing equal housing opportunity regardless of race, religion, or national origin. I wanted to mention all these things, and that's the end of the quote there that I got. And I'll find the source for you, and I'll link to it. I wanted to mention all these things since it establishes that the sin of racism has been a stain on our country since its beginning. And it is something that we've only recently begun to extricate ourselves from, I would argue. The Bible talks about repentance, not only for individual sin, but also the collective sin of the people and remediation for that sin. It's my contention that until that sin is dealt with adequately, the stain remains. In the words of my friend from New Jersey, Dan Zimmerman, he's got a song of that name, and the stain remains because we need to adequately deal with it and repent of that sin. Some recommended reading I wanted to mention. First, I want anybody who is taking the time to watch this, if you haven't already, please read Letter from a Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr. and find it online. It's available online, and I'll link to it as well. But if you search up Letter from a Birmingham Jail, I think there is at least one source that has it. You could read it from beginning to end, probably in a matter of 30 minutes or so. King's words are highly prophetic, and he wrote that in 1963. Again, this is 1963, that's only 59 years ago. But let it sink in. Read that and just imagine, this is another fellow human being in jail because of the color of his skin, and because he was fighting for just a level playing field, and the thought that many were encouraging, hey, slow down, don't, just go slow, moderation, and allow yourself to feel what he was feeling and what others were feeling. I also recommend, and I've read through this myself, the complete autobiographies of Frederick Douglass. And the main one in here is the first one, because the second two have some of the same information, but it's written by himself, and it gives the narrative. The first one of the three in here is narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. It gives his story and what he had to deal with. And again, I would encourage anyone to read that story and allow yourself to really put yourself in the place of Frederick Douglass, and understand that this was the 19th century that this was going on, a little while ago, but again, 100 years later, we still have the ravages of this running through the country. Another book I got from the library, and I have to return, is Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. I read that on my vacation recently. It's a book that was an influence to many in what would become the civil rights movement. It's a manual for fighting hate with love, on the basis of how Jesus showed and shows love. And very good book, very wise words, and I'd recommend it. Another one, The Color of Compromise. I own this one as well, by Jamar Tisby. Is written in 2019. Very timely in light of, it's always very timely in this day and age, but after George Floyd, became especially timely. And he wrote kind of a follow-up or companion book in, I think it was 2021, if not 2020, called How to Defeat Racism. And I read that and got that from the library. But the subtitle of this book is The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism. So it's, and by the way, this is a very heavy podcast episode here. I realize that, but I think it's something that we got to reckon with. And I'm sure there are many of my white brothers and sisters who would say, well, it's selective outrage. What about, you get the whataboutism? What about, things that are, of course we have issues that need to be dealt with. You have, for example, riots and things like that. And as Martin Luther King said, riots, I don't have the quote in front of me, but is the language of the voice of the language of the unheard, or something to that effect. I don't want to misquote, but that when it seems like a last resort, a lot that's sometimes resorted to. And I'm not excusing any of the behavior in any riots that take place, because certainly that's not excusable. But some people might say, well, what about whites or police that have been targeted, or again, I talk about this concept of before of the dualism that we have. Back the blue, and if you back the blue, well, you certainly can't back. You can't be a supporter of Black lives and say that Black lives matter and also say back the blue. Heck yeah, you can. That's just a silly idea that makes no sense. We can love and support our law enforcement, which we should, I would say, but we can also say that there are changes that need to happen in how we as a society collectively deal with one another. Not only on an individual level, because I think that's sometimes what we can do, in our, let's say in our white Christian culture or subculture, we can say, hey, I love everybody. I've got Black friends. I like them. They're good people. So I treat everybody the same. Doesn't matter. And we can think that's enough. That's all I need to do. I just, on an individual level or a one-to-one relationship level, we love our neighbor and we love everybody and we treat everybody kindly. Well, that's good. That's a good thing. I'm not saying it's not and something we all need to do. However, we can also recognize that there are things in place in society that are wrong, that need to be made right. And where it makes sense to do that, we need to look to do that. And that's just being honest with the way things are and dealing with things the way they are. And there's that is also something we need to do as a society. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox there. So back to this book, good book by Jemar Tisby. Again, I talked a little bit about in this episode about how the idea that race is socially constructed. This is something that he talks about here too. And the good news here is that since the concept of race has been made, and of course racism along with it, it can be unmade. That's the good news. And this book gives hope to that end. And there are many practical suggestions that are also expounded upon in his book, How to Defeat Racism. He's got the arc of racial justice, and I'd have to look here again to remind myself, but it's an acronym, ARC. I believe is, I'm going to say, well, look it up. Arc of Racial Justice. Talks about the fierce urgency of now, and really just how to align ourselves and how to think about this. And he's another fellow Christian, and so he's speaking of this from a Christian perspective. Even if you don't agree with everything I'm saying or everything in this book, it's good for us to look into these things and understand better and become more informed. So just for a moment, I just want to say, in terms of moments and movements, sorry. So I talked a bit about the civil rights movement. I want to turn our attention now to other more recent moments and movements. For example, I mentioned Black Lives Matter. We could talk about Stop Asian Hate, Me Too, being three movements or moments. So they are movements, but they also involve what I'm calling moments, basically cultural moments. You could say hashtags, because I think they may have all started out with a hashtag, and then it became a movement from there, from a moment to a movement. So as Christians, and this is what is a struggle for me, we should wholeheartedly affirm that no one should be discriminated against on the basis of their ethnicity or the socially constructed idea of race. But we saw that happening with Asian people in our day, and I've talked about a little bit about, the black experience in our society. But there's no excuse for that or any justification for that. And I just want to mention that the words we use and the posture we have toward our fellow human beings, it matters. And I want to mention too that there were quantifiable increases in violence against our Asian brothers and sisters after leaders used terms like Chinese virus and Kung flu and things like that. As believers in a God who created all humanity in his image, let us affirm at all times that all lives matter. However, in moments where people are made to feel marginalized or less than, let us stand beside our beloved brothers and sisters and assert that, yes, Black lives do matter. And yes, we stand opposed to hatred against our Asian brothers and sisters. Just as if we saw our Latin brothers and sisters being persecuted, or our Native American brothers and sisters being unjustly persecuted, we should stand behind them. That is what Christ wants us to do. It's clear in the Bible. Okay, I will stop here for now, and I thank you for your time and attention. Just want to take a moment to talk about new or music in 2021 that was meaningful. Before I do, I just want to put a quick plug in for a podcast, a music-related podcast that I just love. It's my favorite music-related podcast. It's called True Tunes. John Joseph Thompson and his partner in crime, Bruce A. Brown, I guess, produces it and engineers it and helps John with that kind of stuff. But John curates some great music. He's got a lot of experience in the music business, and he himself is also a musician. And I just really appreciate the True Tunes podcast. He's been around for a while, really since he was in his teens. That's when he started True Tunes, I believe. He could correct me if I'm wrong. But in terms of the podcast that he has, that's fairly new. I think it's only like maybe 3 years old, 2 to 3 years old, in terms of a streaming podcast. But I love it. And so the new music that I discovered this year was due to that podcast. So I want to thank John and Bruce for their work with that podcast. So one of the discoveries this year was Natalie Bergman. Just wonderful album. Just really knocked out by that. Her album called Mercy. It's her first solo album. She and her brother Elliot experienced the loss of their father. She and her brother had a band, also still have a band called Wild Bell. By the way, Natalie Bergman recently came out with a really cool song with Beck. Real fun song released. But before that, in May of this year, on the heels of her losing her father, she recorded this album, and she had she and her brother, of course, too, had lost their mother a few years ago due to cancer. So just a lot of some tragic things happening there. But on the heels of that, and that's the subject actually of a lot of the album called Mercy. And the music is wonderful. The subject matter is gut wrenching at times, because she's talking about the loss of her father, and she's dug deep into her faith, and she's singing to God in a lot of the songs, and it's a wonderful work. I can't recommend that one enough. Another new discovery fairly recently on one of the more recent podcasts, a band called Young Oceans. I'm not too into the whole worship scene, but this is worship music, but it's more ambient than what you hear. Like, I really like another band that I'll mention, The Choir, that's been around for a while. They've got an album called Deep Cuts, which I'll just maybe talk about here in a second, and I just did, so maybe that counts. But with Young Oceans, they have a real atmospheric sound, and that I really appreciate. Another band called Hammock, which has some relation to The Choir in that the guys know each other, and Mark Bird of Hammock, one half of Hammock, along with Andrew, and I'm forgetting, shame on me, but Andrew and Mark Bird are the collective known as Hammock, but they have that same sort of atmospheric stuff going on, and Mark Bird has contributed to the music by The Choir as well. But I checked them out after listening to the recent podcast, and I really recommend that if you're looking for some really good worship music that's just really great to listen to as well, from a music standpoint. Some other albums, I mentioned Deep Cuts, Steve Hindalong's principal songwriter there, and man, they just keep finding, mining from a deep well of a lot of different things, and he likes to write from personal experience, and it's always good stuff. And the 77s, Mike Rowe and Bruce Spencer, I think primarily. I think Mark Harmon was also involved with this in some way, so that's why I consider it maybe a 77s effort. Well, us diehard fans are eagerly anticipating new music from them, and a 88 re-release, that wonderful live album, probably my favorite live album of all time. If you never heard of it, you should check it out, or never heard of the 77s, you should check them out. But Hymn Show mines, a lot of gospel music, from over the last, 80 years or so. Just some great tracks, and the way they do them, it's great stuff. And Mike and the 77s, it's not the first time that they've recorded some gospel blues tracks. 2008, 77s released Holy Ghost Building. That's just great stuff. A lot of Rolling Stones sort of influence on there with the guitars and stuff. And We All Gonna Face the Rising Sun, by Michael Rowe, in 2009. More of that. But Hymn Show is more, I would say more, you'd say maybe more reflective, or more, I don't know. It's got a good mix of, more rocking stuff, but it's got a good, a lot of, more quieter gospel songs. So good stuff. What else from? I want to mention one of my favorite songs. Maybe this will just be my favorite song from 2021. Both in terms of the song itself and the message. Good Trouble by Leigh Nash. And I didn't write down her name, gosh. And she's a wonderful singer, and she's involved with the music on The Chosen. You'll hear her along with Dan Hazeltine, and he's got another guy that plays the music. See, I did not come prepared. I believe the woman that sings with Leigh Nash, I can't pull out her name, and it's a difficult name to just pull out because she's from Nigeria. So anyway, look up that song and you'll see who I'm talking about. They have a video and just the message behind the song. Good Trouble, and it's related to the topic that I was talking about on the podcast today. Leigh Nash has an album, and I'd like to mention that too, called The Tide Volume 1. It's an EP, I guess you call it an EP, not a full album, but she's got various songs that she's recorded this year, including one with her husband. It's just a great track. And another one where she's singing with Tanya Tucker. A lot of great songs there. And of course, Leigh Nash, you just can't go wrong. Great stuff. What else? Johnny Marr has new music. I don't have the name of the album, but it's like another sort of EP kind of thing, I think. But I think he's got a volume 1 and a volume 2 as well. Maybe just 4 songs total, if I'm not mistaken. But good stuff from him, as to be expected, with his guitar playing and just overall really tight musicianship there. Starflyer 59 continues to go strong, and they got new music out. I just recently checked them out, and that was on the basis of, again, JJT, John Joseph Thompson, recommending, I guess, his end of the year stuff on one of his recent podcast episodes. I didn't even realize they had a new album out this year, as they just came out with one, I think, probably 2020, and maybe one in 2019 as well. But yeah, they continue to sound great. I guess you would say my most anticipated album of 2022, and I've also been able to hear it this year because I was part of the, I don't know if it was a, what do you call it? One of those crowdfunding things. I am, anyway, one of those crowdfunding things, and I signed up for it, and so I got to hear it, and I'm really looking forward to getting the vinyl for Terry Scott Taylor's Beautiful Mystery. Oh, and how did I forget? Another one from 2021, Vector's Vital, which you can find on Mezzo Music Limited. That's Mezzo Music Limited. Look that up and find the album by Vector. Long awaited. They haven't made new music for quite a while, but that's really great stuff. Steve Griffith, great vocals, great music, and great stuff. So that's a little bit of some of my favorites. Of course, I'm not listing. There's a lot more that I could have listed, and probably later on I'll think, oh, I should have mentioned this or that, but it's just kind of a survey, and of course it's all very subjective, but those are my favorites, and really encourage you to check them out.
love, love one another. Sisters, brothers, let's love, love, love one another.